While Clostridium botulinum toxin takes the prize for the most toxic substance on a gram-per-gram basis, plants are no slouches. Ricin, hemlock, and cyanide compounds are all part of the plant world's arsenal of defenses. Since they cannot move, or at least not as quickly as animals, plants have evolved a complex array of chemical signals, one of which is very clear: don't eat me. This may be communicated by bitter taste, burning sensations, or other less pleasant effects. Certainly, it seems that neither nicotine nor THC are healthy to breathe. Rather than focus on toxic plants, however, let's focus on toxins specifically found in food plants. So, as you may have guessed, this week's lesson is about toxins found in plant foods. As we introduced last week with animal toxins, there are many ways in which toxins can harm us, and I'm going to add two this week. One is the idea of an allergen. Certainly there are animals which can produce allergenic responses through their proteins, but plants are also on that list, especially of the big 8 allergens. And then also reduction of fertility. So this gets to some new organ systems that may be affected, and certainly plants can affect a variety of organ systems, including the heart, the liver, the kidney, the nervous system, and the immunity, as well as hormonal balances, as we'll see. So today we're going to focus on the first type of plant-related toxin, and that is the one that is produced specifically by plants. Plants are amazing chemists, and you'll see this, I hope, in this lesson. Parts 2, 3, and 4 will be covered more fully in future lessons, but we are going to touch on them just to say that certainly plants can absorb a number of toxins from the environment, and then we consume those plants and we're exposed to those toxins. Plants can be infected by a number of microbes, and then toxin can be produced. We can eat those plants and be affected. And finally, processing of foods, or potentially lack of proper processing, can result in the formation of toxins that we then consume as a result of consuming plant-related foods. So in terms of the toxins produced by plants, there is quite a list, and we're going to go very briefly over a list of major toxins produced by food plants. There are many others, and if you look in the reference section at the end of this lesson, you'll be able to find many more resources, but this is designed to give you an overview of what plants can do, especially the plants that we consume as foods. So certainly we know that there are allergens present. Plants can produce anti-nutrients. As I indicated, they do not want to be consumed, so they can produce materials that prevent us from easily digesting them. They can make bioactive peptides with a variety of effects. They can produce cyanide-related compounds. They can affect thyroid function. They can cause blood cells to clump together. They can act like hormones. They can also cause a number of toxic effects, especially if plants are not stored properly. And finally, stimulants and overstimulation can cause a number of toxic effects. So we'll go through those in a little bit more detail. We'll start with the first one, allergens and intolerances. So gluten and gliadin, we'll consider those together since very often they affect similar groups of people. Gluten is going to affect those individuals who have genetic predisposition as a result of having celiac disease. Gliadin is another component of the proteins that together make up gluten. So gluten is actually made of gluten and gliadin together, and this protein is produced when a bread dough is made by adding water and kneading. Gliadin is one of those two proteins, and so certain individuals are specifically sensitive to just that one, and that's referred to as celiac sprue. So 3, 4, and 5 disaccharides like sucrose, and then monosaccharides like galactose, lactose, and to a lesser extent fructose. We don't have that on the list just because it's a bit more rare, but even monosaccharides can produce effects based on intolerance. There are some genetic abnormalities in which individuals cannot split apart disaccharides very easily, and this is completely separate from lactose intolerance, which is something that after age 3 is normal for most of the world's population. So there are issues with both disaccharides and monosaccharides in terms of ability to digest. If they're not properly digested, all of them can cause some pretty severe GI tract effects. Fauvism is actually genetically related, and it's related to an inability to process specific types of proteins present in fava beans, and as a result, those individuals are unable to consume those fava beans, or they will experience a type of anemia. Bioactive peptides are something that are found throughout nature, and certainly we as humans produce bioactive peptides. They're found certainly in animal products, as we saw last week with histamine production in scromboid poisoning. But they can also be found in the plant world. So fruits and vegetables can produce a number of short amino acid sequences, which are bioactive, and this is a brief and not complete list of foods, fruits, and vegetables which can affect not only xenobiotic metabolism potentially, but also potentially affect blood flow. So avocado, a variety of different fruit juices. As you see, I'm drinking some fruit juice there in Peru in the picture. Spinach, St. John's wort, which is an herb sometimes used to promote immunity. A variety of different types of vegetables, beets as well, may produce these types of effects. So plants not wanting to be consumed, they can inhibit consumption in a variety of ways. One of the ways they can do that is producing antivitamins, and one example of that would be antithiamine compounds. These are found in fruits like blueberries. They can be found in root vegetables like beets or in Brussels sprouts. And so the inhibition of the vitamin activity can then prevent the growth of an animal potentially that is attempting to consume that particular plant. These can be inactivated very often by heat. Bowman-Burke inhibitors in a similar way can be inactivated by heat. These are found in soy, and they specifically inhibit protein digestion. So you can see there are a number of ways by which plants can prevent herbivores and other things that might be consuming them from thriving. Oxalic acid is a material that binds very strongly to calcium and to other minerals, and is famously found in rhubarb. So if you've ever had a slice of strawberry rhubarb pie, remember that one slice, probably okay. 2 slices, maybe not so much. The whole pie, not a great idea. So the presence of this oxalic acid can cause the minerals to precipitate out, potentially forming kidney stones or other types of issues in individuals that consume too much oxalic acid. Plants produce cyanide compounds to protect themselves. These cyanide compounds are often attached to sugars, and that's why they're referred to as cyanogenic glycosides. They can be freed to form cyanide by digestion or by cooking. And the activity of cyanide specifically is to inhibit oxygen exchange, which means if you do not receive a lethal dose, then you can receive a dose which inhibits the ability to exchange air, or exchange oxygen rather, and induce some of those low oxygen effects. A number of plants contain this. Cassava, which is used frequently to produce things like tapioca, or can be consumed as is. Elderberries, another plant that produces cyanide. And this plant, the last one, pokeberries. Pokeberries are a very common weed that grows here in North Carolina, and you can see a picture on the right-hand side of pokeberries that I took in my backyard. You'll find these very commonly. Now, that's not to say that these foods can never be eaten. In fact, all of these foods are eaten, and typically what's done is that they are thoroughly cooked, and that allows the cyanide, or most of the cyanide compounds, to leave the food prior to consuming it. What that means is that as a person preparing it, you need to be very careful about standing over whatever pot or other apparatus is cooking that, because you may get a dose of cyanide yourself. So again, these are cyanide-containing materials, but the cyanide can be removed by proper and extensive cooking techniques. Goitrogens. These basically are anti-thyroid compounds. So the thyroid gland being one of the glands that really is influencing our metabolism, and brassica vegetables. That would include broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, can inhibit the activity of the thyroid and actually function against the thyroid. Some individuals with particular genetic predisposition actually fare worse when they're consuming brassica and other goitrogen-containing materials. And interestingly, the same glucosinolates, which are looked at as potentially beneficial with regard to cancer prevention, may also have this goitrogenic activity. So plants produce lectins, and lectins can be found in beans and grains. These are glycoproteins. That means proteins associated with sugars. And these glycoproteins can bind to food carbohydrates and thus inhibit their absorption. They can bind to intestinal proteins, also inhibiting the absorption of those carbohydrates. If they get into the bloodstream, they can cause blood cells to stick together, and this is called a hemagglutinin activity. So phytohemagglutinin, which is found in white, red, and black fava beans, can cause this effect, and some of this can then result in more severe symptoms, nausea and vomiting. The most famous or infamous, if you're a Breaking Bad fan, is ricin. This is a lectin from castor beans, and it is one of the most toxic substances known, and it happens to be produced by plants. Plants can produce phytoestrogens, and these, just as it sounds, are estrogen-like compounds in terms of their structure. They can be found in a number of different plants. Red clover is one famous example. This is not something that humans typically eat, but red clover is something that cattle and other grazing animals can eat. Red clover contains high levels of phytoestrogens, more specifically the isoflavones like genistein, which is shown on the left-hand side. Now, I think it doesn't really take a chemist to see that genistein, which is a plant compound, resembles estradiol, which is a human estrogen compound, quite a bit. So genistein is also found in soy and in soy-based products. So these estrogen-like compounds, depending on your perspective, can either have mild estrogenic effects, or if estrogen is present, then they can have anti-estrogenic effects. So it really depends on whether you're talking about these compounds in the presence of estrogen or in the absence of estrogen. But in either way, they can certainly affect hormonal balance. Solanine is produced by nightshades, and nightshades include plants or plant products like potatoes, tomatoes, eggplant, and chili peppers. And these can especially be produced when those types of plants are not stored properly. Potatoes are really the most famous example of this. When potatoes are stored in the light and allowed to sprout, you'll see a greenish color on the surface, and this is a good indication that that material should not be consumed. So solanine is a significantly toxic compound and has caused significant problems in a variety of places where it's been consumed regularly, including Ireland. Stimulants. Plants produce a number of stimulant compounds in terms of what they do to humans and to some animals when they're consumed. One of the most famous examples of this would be caffeine and its chemical cousin theobromine, which basically is caffeine without one methyl group. As you can see there on the right-hand side, theobromine is missing one of the three methyl groups that caffeine possesses. There are a number of products which provide extra high caffeine, and you can see one of the products below there. Nicotine is another stimulant in plants, and I know you're thinking, well, I don't really consider chewing tobacco to be a food. Well, you don't have to go to tobacco at all to get nicotine. Nicotine is also present in some nightshade plants, such as eggplant. And I think my students are typically surprised by that, but yes, nicotine can be found in eggplant. Cocaine, again, this is considered a drug of abuse, but also realize that there are indigenous populations which consume this material in a tea form or in the form of a leaf, which is much less well absorbed than the powder form, and therefore the dose is significantly lower. But all of these stimulants at a very high dose can have negative effects on the cardiovascular system, on the heart especially, and on other parts of our physiology. So one thing to consider is what these materials are. I've been referring to them as plant toxins, but when I think about this, it really does come back to dose all over again. So the things that we call plant toxins are really toxins at the wrong dose. And another way to consider them is that they are, in many cases, phytoalexins. These are materials that are produced by plants, which are being stressed by very high sun exposure, potentially, by infections with particular microbes, by insect pests, or by herbivores. And these compounds are produced often to ward off those those pests or to guard against things like sun damage. So this is another way to think about it. A third way to think about these materials is that some of them, at the right dose, appear to actually have beneficial effects, and we've seen this before. This is that hormesis effect, where at the right dose something can actually be beneficial, where at a higher dose it might actually be quite harmful. And I think a lot of the plant toxins that we've already mentioned would fall into this category. All right, so moving away from the plant toxins themselves that are produced by plants, we should also consider that we consume plants, and those plants may have pesticide residues on them. And there have been a number of concerns and scandals about these residues. Alar on apples, for instance, was a great concern in the past. One of the greatest concerns now is the effect of pesticides, not on consumers, but on the individuals that apply pesticides and how they might be affected as a result of being in the field applying these pesticides daily versus those individuals that simply go to the store and purchase foods that may have had pesticides used on them. Very often those pesticides have degraded or are at very low levels, but the individuals that apply them can be exposed to them at higher levels and can be exposed for longer periods of time. They may also take their clothes home and expose their family members to the same types of toxins. Solvent residues, when we think about things like oil extraction, say, for instance, the production of olive oil, one of the things that's done is to use a food-grade solvent, for instance, like hexane. If not all of that material is evaporated off, then this can also produce some toxic effects. So the presence of solvents in plant extracts can be an issue. Heavy metals is of great concern for the chocolate industry, and one of the reasons is because in many countries where chocolate is grown, leaded gasoline is still used. It gets into the atmosphere, it lands on the ground, it gets into the soil, and the chocolate plants pull it up, and now it's in the chocolate itself. There are other heavy metals, cadmium, for instance, which are of concern in chocolate as well. So this is an ongoing issue. And then, of course, radioactive materials. So there are plants around Chernobyl, the nuclear plant which exploded a number of years ago, and those plants are taking up radioactive material, and so they should not be consumed because they're actively taking up some of those radioisotopes. So this is rather rare, but it is something that can cause toxic effects. So there are many things in the environment, could be in the air, could be in the soil, could be in the water, and those things can cause toxic effects. Microbial plant food toxins. So we have mold-related toxins, and we'll discuss those, including aflatoxins, ochratoxins, and many other mold-related type toxins. Certainly, bacteria like Clostridium botulinum can produce very powerful toxins in improperly processed low-acid canned foods. So certainly, this is coming from bacteria, but it's in a plant food that an individual might consume. Perhaps green beans or corn, things that are relatively low acid, or if you want to think about it the other way, relatively high in pH. They're certainly above that 4.6 pH that we'd like to see to prevent Clostridium botulinum intoxication. We can produce toxins from plants by food processing, and this is another thing that we'll cover later, but just very briefly to say that acrylamide, which is of great concern now in the coffee industry, is produced as a result of the interaction of carbohydrates with amino acids, and plants can have both of those together, and acrylamide can be produced by high heat, as in things like baking and frying, especially if the pH is high. Furan is another component of non-enzymatic browning, and so in general, Maillard browning products are being investigated to understand how they might affect humans, and of course, those Maillard browning products are typically formed by the interaction of sugars coming from plants and some protein, which may be a plant protein or maybe an animal protein. But again, you could be consuming something that is mostly plants, bread or something along that line, and be getting some of these toxins as a result. So in summary, most of the toxins that we've discussed have been produced by plants themselves, and plants produce a very wide array. I would encourage you to look at the references just to see how many different types of toxins they produce. We can see certainly that plants can absorb toxins from their environment, that microbes can produce toxins in plants that we might consume as food, and that food processing can convert plants or plant products into potential toxins. So here are the references. These references are available on the Moodle homepage, so all of these can be accessed directly through the Moodle homepage using the links at the top. And for the very top reference, you'll need to log in as an NC State student. But the other two you can freely open and be able to access those directly from the Moodle page. So I hope that this has been helpful in terms of understanding how plants can make toxins, and I hope that you're enjoying reading this week's assignments on plant toxins as well. All right, take care, everybody.